Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Copper Club podcast. I'm Nathan Joys, and of course, I'm joined by Peter Pankovski. Peter, how are we doing, mate?
Oh, it's always good to be here. So I'm doing just fine, thank you. You?
Wonderful stuff. I'm doing good, and look, we're not alone because we're joined by Albert Hilton, who's making his podcast debut. You've probably seen him behind the scenes writing a few articles here and there, but look, we're going to get him on for a few visuals. He's going to come onto the podcast and add some stats in around the Peter and I's rambling. So look, Albert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah.
We're going to dive into a few different topics on this particular podcast. We've decided to record this awkwardly in between the Libertadores and Sudamericana semi-finals. So we will talk about that in the Libertadores final special episode we'll do in a few weeks' time. We're going to open up talking about the atmosphere at River Plate last night. Yes, the football on the pitch was horrendous, incredibly disappointing, and we'll dive into why River are sort of stalling at the moment. Not just River, maybe Argentinian football as a whole. But the atmosphere at El Monumento last night, people would have woken up and seen all over Twitter the incredible fireworks and atmospheres. There were even warming up like 30, 40 minutes before the game. Like the game even got delayed another 15 minutes because of what was going on pretty much in the stands. But then River really disappointed on the pitch. But one story which has sort of come out, I've tried to look around. It seems as if it's a reliable source, but I'm not sure. But people may have seen this. The fact that River apparently painted Minero's dressing room with some sort of paint, which was letting off horrendous like fumes or something like that to try and, I'm not sure what it was. It was peak South America. I'm not sure if it's true. It clearly didn't work, but it's why we love the competition. But let's talk about the problems on the pitch, and maybe not specifically River, but with just Argentinian football, which is massively falling behind Brazilian football. And the Libertadores, yes, Boca somehow made it to the final last year without winning a knockout game. But there's just been this growing gap between Brazilian football and Argentinian football. And the amount of teams now in the finals, it's just dominated by Brazilian teams. Albert, you've obviously spent time in Argentina. You've covered plenty of games. You live and breathe it. Can you provide us with a little bit more insight as to why that gap is potentially happening and if there's a quick fix for this solution?
So I'd mainly say that the one big difference, obviously, is the funding in Brazilian football compared to Argentinian football. So especially if you take Botafogo, for example, they've got multi-millionaire owner John Denver, is it?
John
Textor, who owns clubs all around the world. And then you compare that to, say River or even a Boca, they just don't have the same amount of funding. And for me, it's more of a cultural difference, because the fans essentially have a much bigger say in how clubs are run in Argentina, which on the one hand is great because as a fan, that's what you want. You want to have a say in how your club is ran. But on the flip side of that, they're ultimately losing out in continental competitions because the funding's just not there.
There was a sizable gap. Even we go to that first leg, Minero, which beat River 3-0 at home. Like, the only way to describe it is Minero were really struggling, 2 or 3 months ago, and brought in Davison. Yes, he may be 33, but on a big wage, and he's proven in Brazil, and what a character. I know he was riling up the fans again last night. He's brilliant for the game, depending on if he's in your team or not. He knows what he's doing, he's experienced, but someone like Minero still could go out and spend a little bit of cash and bring somebody else in, where we saw with River last night, apart from Miguel Boya, he missed a few chances in the first half. There wasn't really anybody there, and River have brought in a fair few defenders of late and shored up the defence domestically. But going forward, it's been incredibly boring and tedious to watch River at times this season. And then, yeah, like you said, like John Textor, who owns Lyon, Crystal Palace, was trying to buy Everton, like the rules have relaxed when it's come to owning Brazilian teams in the last 2 or 3 years, and foreign investment has come in, which has made the league tenfold better. I think even in the last 12, 18 months, I've noticed a huge difference. And Botafogo, as you brought them up, broke the transfer record twice in the same window, bringing in Luis Enrique and then bringing in Thiago Almada, who have been like wonderful additions, and rightly so. They're probably going to be in the final of the Libertadores. I know this podcast is going the day afterwards, so if Penarol somehow squeeze 5 or 6 past them, I'm going to look like an idiot here. But that's happened in Argentina as well, hasn't it, Albert, in terms of that now Argentinian teams are almost welcoming that funding from outside of fan-owned clubs. But there's that friction, isn't there, as to whether or not they accept it or not, and will it have that impact on culture out there?
Yeah, so when you're speaking to people in Argentina, there's a very very big divide on whether they want these SADs to come in, as it's called, or not. So if you're talking to obviously a member of the club, they're usually against it. But if you're talking to someone who enjoys football as a whole, they're usually for it. So there is this massive divide, and obviously with Milei as well, the president, there's also a massive divide there in the country. But I don't want to touch on politics too much because that would just lead you down a massive rabbit hole. But yeah, as I said, there is just a massive divide, and there's no way to determine whether it would be a good thing or a bad thing until someone, say, comes in and spends some money on a team, and then that's when you can really judge it. But for the foreseeable, I don't see it happening. Anyone actually coming to invest in Argentinian football?
And it sort of ruins it a little bit, because I love the Libertadores. That's what got me into South American football, because anyone can beat anybody, and like there's never really back-to-back winners. But look, there's been a noticeable trend now for the last 3-4 years, and it's just dominated by Brazilian teams, and no one's bridging that gap. And I can't see that changing until investment happens. Investment's not going to be pulled out of Brazil because the league's growing. And look, Brazilian teams are now pulling players like Depay and Payet to the league, and not even just to finish their days. Especially Depay is coming in, almost like rallied Corinthians and took them out of the relegation zone at the time of recording. So big names are coming across. The league's drastically improving, but it's just going to mean that tournament is just dominated by Brazilian teams. And is it going to lose its edge? Peter, I'm not sure if you're sharing the same concerns as myself here.
As kind of a biased Brazilian watcher, not really. But no, the thing here is that I feel just purely demographically, it's somewhat normal considering Brazil is vastly bigger than Argentina. So more region, more people, more investment, more opportunities there. So yes, I know the country in general isn't exactly the most obviously financed country in the world, that is, but at the same time, I'm not really surprised that this has kind of happened to the level that it's conspired to. Yes, perhaps it is a bit concerning because Argentina is kind of still one of probably the top 5 nations in terms of world football. Like on a consistent basis, you have world-class players being churned out. This is not a case of, say, and this is no disrespect obviously, but the likes of Ecuador, Colombia and so on, that yes, they may have certain players that kind of jump out to the biggest tier of clubs, but they're not on a regular basis to the point of Argentina or Brazil. And I get the authenticity part of it for clubs because Brazil kind of tackled that issue, but it feels one where Red Bull kind of broke the mold in Brazil, and they were the first club that saw foreign investment to that level. Not exactly the same level because they aren't actually invested through a lot, but they were the one authentic club that mixed Bragantino with Red Bull Brazil and just turned into what we now know as Red Bull Bragantino. And since then, I feel kind of just Brazilians kind of got used to it. It's one where if the country and the football like landscape allows it once, they'll just get used to it, really. So obviously in Brazil, there's, as I said, a lot more opportunities for sponsors, and a lot of clubs actually hinge on those sponsors. Like a lot of them live off them, if anything. But I don't expect Argentina to be that much behind than they currently are. So it's one where I just don't know why it's being allowed to go on like this. As I said, I get the authenticity part of it, but at what point do you want the football to just decrease to such levels? Because right now, if hypothetically speaking, you put Boca or River in the Brasileirão, where do you actually place them? Like, just give a thought about
No,
it.
that's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I hadn't thought of it that way. It's always that debate in England, isn't it? Where if you put Celtic and Rangers into the Premier League, where would they finish? And people will say, well, they get relegated. And you've touched on Bragantino there. Bragantino almost won the league last season, and now they could be getting relegated this year. Like, it's so competitive. It's not as if there's 2 or 3 teams dominating the Brazilian football. We will get into that incredible title race very soon. But there's so many teams in there week in, week out, which makes it so competitive. So maybe it's
But prior to
proving
that,
that the investment. Go on.
sorry for cutting you off. I was just going to say, but
No, no.
prior to actually Palmeiras and Botafogo, now Botafogo are just recently now invested into, yes. Before that, we had Flamengo, who spent ridiculous amounts of money. And even prior to that, Cruzeiro got into massive debt issues because they spent stupidly, if anything, and got relegated for it. So it's like a consistent cycle there, but kind of the money keeps flowing, internally at least. So that's just my question. Maybe with Argentina, the only thing is you'll always have the 2 powerhouses there. Like there's 1 in a million chance a repeat of the River Plate relegation happens to any of the 2 clubs. Whereas with others, like say, I don't even remember, like Argentinos, whoever, Racing or whatever, maybe that happens to them, or maybe they fall off a little bit, then they come back. But the 2 powerhouses maintain. It's almost one where, like La Liga, like for example, the 2 big clubs in La Liga are always going to have the money. Well, we know Barcelona now have an issue, but you get what I'm referencing. And then the lower tier clubs actually are so vastly off it that you just don't have the same level of investment compared to a Premier League where things are always competitive.
You could take that. We could argue this all day. You could take that further and say, well, the Premier League's now 3 or 4 leagues in one, which is why people are now looking across to South America to get their fix. And I still like the edge that anyone can beat anybody, especially even in Brazil, even in Argentinian football. But look, Albert said that he doesn't expect any change within 3 or 4 years, and they're already behind. So it's alarm bells going in my head, really, that look, it could be a decade plus before anything changes. And we've seen Ecuadorian teams, especially in the Sudamericana, like showcase that they can compete. Independiente de Valle, Liga de Quito, but their funds are even more limited, so they're only going to get snippets of success here and there. But it's not particularly, say, all doom and gloom, because as we're talking about this, we have Racing and Lanús in the Sudamericana semi-finals. Whether they take the next step or not, we'll find out by the time the podcast is out. But look, 2 teams who have reached that stage, and maybe Argentinian fans are looking at that going, well, we should be competing in the Libertadores for the final places, not the Sudamericana. It's almost recognising where you are at the moment, and just that investment is crying out. And yeah, it's a little bit concerning to hear from an expert like Albert that teams aren't really looking at it just yet. So look, the Brazilian League is going to keep on growing. And as we've touched upon them already, we'll move across to the next part of the podcast, where we're going to talk about that all important Brazilian title race at the moment. Botafogo, who famously bottled that 18 points. Was it 18 points in the end?
18
last
points,
season? Between 15 and 18, it was something ridiculous. They absolutely choked. But it's a completely different team this year, and they're 3 points clear at the moment with 7 rounds to go of Palmeiras. And Palmeiras came out of nowhere last year, and I'm almost expecting it, but they've stalled in recent weeks. The 2-2 draw with Fortaleza will put them on the back foot a little bit. And I expected this Libertadores run from Botafogo to almost sort of spread them a little bit too thin. But they've coped so far. And I think the ironic part about Botafogo, who I think it's 1968 since their last title, so like it's going to be an incredible day if they do hang on. But the thing is with Botafogo, they only had Tequino Suarez last season, and they were crying out for a second striker. Now, if you look at the Brazilian top goal scorers, Luis Enrique is their top goal scorer with 6. They haven't really replaced him with somebody who's going to get 10, 15, 20 goals. I know they brought in Iker Jesus later on, who's on a 5 or 6, and he's gotten to the Brazilian national team. But everything's clicking, and what I really like about Botafogo is that they're settled not only on the pitch, but also the dugout. Last season, if you include caretaker managers, and I might get this wrong off the top of my head, but they had 6 or 7 different managers last season. As soon as Luis Castro left and decided to go to Saudi Arabia, they just had a new manager, what appeared to be every other week. And it was a case of trying to get somebody in who could just get them over the line, and it failed. But this time round, bringing in Artur Jorge, ex-Braga manager, someone disciplined, who's got them playing incredibly well. Yes, they've spent big, but as Peter rightly pointed out, Flamengo and Palmeiras, especially Flamengo, have been spending big for years, and there hasn't always been success out of it, especially of late. And 3 points clear, 7 games to go. Peter, where do you see this one going? Because squeaky bum time for both teams, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, to be honest, I'd have Botafogo to win it, not just because it's the more obvious choice to the outside watcher, but I feel, and we spoke about it before the pod, Palmeiras are one that a bit of an over-reliance right now on a young certain talent that's going to Chelsea. So, yeah, that's point score here. But
you can say his name, it's okay.
It's Esteval, yes. It's enough for me. It's just, I'm still phenomenally amazed that Chelsea have gotten Kendry and Esteval. It's kind of coping mechanism for me, still not enough. But anyways,
I think Esteval has shown so much more than Paez, and we're not going to get into
maturity.
That
I'd say maturity. Maturity is key there. I feel the latter has just a lot of it, whereas Kendry has kind of been hyped. But yeah, debate for another day. Anyways,
yeah,
it's just a bit too much of over reliance, and I'll say I don't feel like Esteval is one that has a problem in coping with the pressure of delivering results right now. I feel it's one where he's already had 3 injuries this year, where they've not been major, yes, but they've kept him out for more than a week or two. And with Brazil's schedule right now, with the championship scheduled to come to an end, I think it's the end of November and we're already towards the start of November actually. So he has 4 weeks, I believe, of football tops left, maybe even less. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. And as such, it's one where, quite honestly, you have a situation of do Palmeiras actually have enough other than Esteval to get over the hump? I know the world-class players they have, and I'm saying world-class in terms of, obviously, Brazil levels, that is, but is it one where they can get over the hump with that at hand? Because Botafogo, on the flip side of it, have enough depth in their squad to keep this level, or even if they have like a drop-off, it won't be that. It will be marginal. And if it's marginal, then yes, they have the trickier games at hand, but they could get through them in a much better way than Palmeiras, I feel. And they also have a direct tie at hand, the two sides. If Botafogo win that, I'd say it's curtains for me.
It is at Palmeiras, so looking at the fixtures where there could be some... but Botafogo have to go away to Palmeiras, and I think that is the decider. But the fact that they've already got a 3-point gap, it may not all hang on that. If they lose that but win their other 6, they'll be fine. But I like how you're touching on there with Esteval. Almost feels deja vu to last season, how Palmeiras relied on a certain Endrick to get them over the line. He just turned up in the last 2 or 3 months when Abel Ferreira finally trusted him to lead the line. But with teams like Bragantino and Botafogo struggling towards the end of the season, he was able to score. Palmeiras were able to go to the top, win the league. It's a little bit more complicated this time around. Yes, Esteval's doing amazing things. 19 goal contributions in 25 games. He's only started 20 of them, and he's averaged 64 minutes in those games. So we've been banging on about Esteval, I think, ever since the podcast began, and I don't think people realise how good a deal this is for Chelsea. But
I mean, it's more than Neymar. That's
It's
just
more than
saying,
Neymar. He's broke Neymar's
yeah,
record in less than 20, 25 games in total, which is absurd. And as you said, Palmeiras have talent. Like Rafael Veiga seems to always come alive towards the end of the season. Scored a hat trick against Juventus the other day out of absolutely nowhere. He's turning it up, Mr. Palmeiras, and being reliable for them. But everything is on Esteval, where he said Botafogo have 5 or 6 top quality players. Yes, they're not reliant on a certain striker as in Tiquino Suarez as they were last year, but Savarino, Almada, Henrique, Iga Jesus, etc. There's just so much depth there where they could end up with both the Libertadores and the title in Brazil, which is just ridiculous. Albert, weigh in with your thoughts here. What do you think? Which way is this going to go? Peter's going Botafogo. I'm going to stick with Palmeiras. I'm being stubborn. I think Botafogo will win the Libertadores and Palmeiras will have a league, and they'll quite happily handshake on that agreement if both end up with a title. But which way do you see it going?
It is so hard to call. I'm going to go Palmeiras just because of Esteval. That's pretty much it. And as well, obviously, the Libertadores, the final, which they're ultimately going to play in, it's going to weigh heavy on them. And if you were to ask them, the fans, I'm sure they'd take a Libertadores rather than a league title.
Yeah, there'll be some greedy fans out there wanting both, but I think you're right. It's the Libertadores is always the premium, isn't it? So I just think the fact that with them being 3 points ahead of Palmeiras at this moment with 7 games to go, they would say the Libertadores. Ask them 2 weeks out if they're in the same position. That's when greed might come into the question. So look, really interesting. Definitely keep an eye on the Brazilian title race, which is going on. Let's move across and talk about a few players because look, we're almost at November, which is ridiculous. So that means we have to inevitably talk about the January transfer window. So we've all picked a few players here which we think may be moving on in this particular window or players to keep an eye on. Pete, I'm going to come to you first because I know you've got a controversial striker who you want to talk about. And I'm interested to see where this particular debate goes because, well, look, the floor is yours and we'll get into it very soon. And Albert can pop in with some stats to either back you up or disagree with you.
Well, just a disclaimer, I am not a fan of the players, just so you know, you're well aware of that. But as someone who's been linked with moves to England for like a good 3 years now, especially West Ham, who get linked to every other striker in the world, but and never mind. But Yuri Alberto is my number one pick. As in, I feel the form that he has kind of showcased over the past month, especially in a dire sequence for Corinthians, who, as you said, were close to the relegation zone. They were in the relegation zone, that is. They're now close off it. But again, it's one where I think it was from it's 8 or 9 teams could still get relegated. Like that's just the margin of points in between. So we're
Best
saying
league
it's
in the world.
yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, Yuri Alberto is one where he's such an enigma to me. Like for years now, I've banged on the drum that he's a bang average striker in a bang average team that will most likely never live up to anything spectacular in his career. And again, I'm not a footballer, so I'm sorry for saying this in the most disrespectful way possible. But that being said, it's just how I feel about him. He's a decent player, yes, but nothing too amazing. And yet, on the flip side of it, I consistently see him linked to West Ham, linked to Southampton, it was, I think. He used to play for Zenit St. Petersburg. Before that, he was linked to someone else in Europe. I don't remember who. A plethora of Italian teams wanted him when he was breaking out. And it's one where I've never known the reason why he's so highly rated. It's one of those moves to Russia that didn't actually surprise me because it made sense for him to go and chase the money and actually excel in a league that will likely be to his standards. And now
Do
over the
you
course
know,
of
by
the
the
last
way,
month,
I'm gonna cut you in here, right? Before you
yeah,
finish your
dude,
bit. Do you know how much money he went from International to Zenit for?
I think it was
'Cause
6 million euros, something of sorts. But I may be wrong.
way higher. According to my app here on Flash Score, it is 25 million euros.
Whoa.
he went in 2022, and then he came to Corinthians in 2023 as a free agent.
Jesus.
I will need to double
Yeah,
check
he was
that
back
through
on
other
loan
sources,
because of
but
all the war, and yeah, he threw a fuss.
$25
Unironically,
million.
yeah, unironically, I was helping out cover the Russian league back then, and he ran away. He said he didn't want to come back to Russia, so that's why he got cut off. Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Anyways,
that's
it's just one that, yeah, 25 million. I mean, back then at least he was kind of making something like a stride of form, and you can see kind of some potential there. It's almost like if you have to compare him to previous names that have been hyped up and then never lived up to expectations, like Leandro Damiao pops up into your mind immediately, and Damiao was miles better than Yuri Alberto at that level, miles better. Like it's not even up for debate. So it's one where I'm not, due to his form now, I suspect that he might actually get a move somewhere, and some club will bank on that form to actually be replicated, and I will be shocked, but I wouldn't be surprised. If you understand what I mean by shocked but not surprised.
No, I think the way you've put it there, Yuri Alberto is an enigma, 100%. Because I think it's funny, isn't it? Like you said there, he's always been linked with West Ham, Southampton, those sort of teams towards the end of the transfer window, where if they haven't got target A, B, C, D, E, they are sort of scrambling, and it's almost an exciting signing if you look at it outside in, if you've never watched him play. If you look at his profile and where he's come from, Santos Academy, 23, Brazilian, people get excited about that. And it's really difficult to know where I stand with this, because I think I've been very much the same as you, Pete. I've been very sort of opinionated on Yuri Alberto. And every time, I think he got linked with Forest the other window, and I was like, no, I'm not having it. It's not good enough. However, if I am going to throw a curveball, just for maybe argument's sake, but also what I genuinely believe after what I've seen over the last 4 to 6 weeks, and I know you can't define a player on a 4 to 6 weeks period, but he scored 8 goals in 23 games in Serie A. He's also scored 8 goals in 9 Sudamericana games. He has come alive in the last 4 to 6 weeks. Why has he come to life? Well, I think because of the addition of Memphis Depay, playing alongside somebody who's better than him, who can provide him good service. They've obviously seemed to get on from the relationships on the celebrations on the pitch in recent weeks, and he seems to have a spring in his step. And I know there's this compilation of Yuri Alberto falling over all the time and missing sitters, but he's continuously been in a poor side. Now, we hyped up Wesley, not just us, loads of people hyped up Wesley, and yet he wasn't scoring hardly any goals. I know he's a winger in a different position, but he's gone across to Saudi Arabia, and at the moment he's done nothing. I've watched a couple of games, and he's been incredibly poor. So I actually think what Alberto is doing in an incredibly poor side is really, really impressive. And the question I have here is, if he's playing with better players around him, would that bring a better side of him out permanently? The addition of Depay has been really strong for him, and if he keeps Corinthians up, if they win the Sudamericana, like, he's ticking a lot of boxes there for
Yeah.
10 million euros. Is it worth a gamble? I know I've come full circle here. Al, before I go back to you, Peter, Albert, do you have any stats which you can lean on here, which we haven't already touched upon, which either echo our thoughts or not? Because it's confusing, isn't it?
Yeah, so he is a very confusing footballer. He's as you say, it's a really good time to come into form, because obviously come January he'll be looking at a move, and he's got 6 in his last 6, 2 goals in the semi-final against Racing, and say he does something this week in the Sudamericana, he could potentially put Corinthians on his back and take them to the final. But at the same time, he doesn't actually offer that much, if that makes sense. So he's only created 18 chances in 19 games in the league, I believe. And it's not great. There's 4 assists as well. It's, if you're looking for something other than a goal scorer, well, he's scoring goals now, but he's not really would you call him a proven goal scorer?
Not
No,
looking at his record, I
no,
think
no.
since he left International for Zenit back in 2021-22, he scored 12 goals in 33 games, and then since, this has been by far his best season if we combine everything, and that's because of the Sudamericana run.
Yeah.
I will give him a benefit of the doubt. For the last 18 months to 24 months, he has been playing in a poor side where they haven't had anyone creating anything really for him. And all the best players have been plucked from Corinthians as soon as they've started to show any sort of like improvement or worth, i.e. Murillo, for example,
Yeah, but
Wesley. Go on, Peter.
those are defensive players. Like we can't expect Moscardo and Wesley and like okay, Wesley, fair enough.
I'm touching on them
Fair
because of
enough,
how...
but he's not being good.
No.
Come on now.
That's what I was getting to. I was going to say is that as soon as those players have performed well for 3 to 6 months, they've been signed. Like you said, Moscardo, PSG, Murillo, Forest, right? They've all gone straight away. Yuri Alberto is now back in Brazil. He's 23, 24 next March. So by the time the next season comes around, he's going to be into his mid-20s, where apparently that's deemed old in the world of football. And the fact that nobody has brought him across back since says a lot. But it's just the continuous links which come back to Europe, which continuously surprise me. I'm not changing my stance all of a sudden because he started scoring, but the addition of Depay has really elevated his game, and you can't ignore that. I can't sit here and criticize a player continuously, and then when he starts playing well, that I have to just stick with my opinion. But I do think the Premier League would be out of reach, and I don't think he's obviously going to be going back to Russia. So his next move is going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
And move
Saudi
back to
Arabia.
International. And move back to International could be on the cards. They're a team who are really progressing in Brazil at the moment. So, look, we could debate Yuri Alberto all day. I think we're still... I was going to say we're on the fence. We're clearly not. But it's interesting one to start. If he does move to Europe, then obviously I will be his biggest fan and I'll be rooting for him. But I'm not convinced that that's going to happen just yet. Let's pause on Brazil and move to Argentina. Albert, you've got a couple of names, but let's start off with the 20-year-old Velez player who's... I hate saying burst onto the scene. I keep doing it on this podcast at the moment. But he has, hasn't he? Over to you for Thiago Fernandez.
Yeah. If Velez win the league this year, which they have a good chance of doing for the first time in a long time, he's going to be one of those players that will be picked out of that team and ultimately be on his way to Europe. There's already rumours of Lazio. I've heard mentions of Liverpool, but I see it doubtful. And I believe maybe even Manchester United.
Man United get linked with bloody
They've
everybody.
been linked with
so
everyone.
We can park that.
It's all rumours, but they are big clubs to be, have your name around.
Who is he? Like, just for someone who hasn't watched him, what position is he?
Right.
How old is he? How has he done this season? Why are these big clubs being linked with him, whether it's true or not?
So he's a left winger, a right-footed left winger. He's 20 years old, and he made his debut last summer. So he's been in and around the Velez team for about just over a year, maybe. He's played 18 games, 18 starts, that is, 5 goals, 6 assists, which are pretty impressive numbers for a 20-year-old, especially in Argentina. Because, as well, someone I like to compare him to is Benjamin Dominguez, who's gone to Bologna. And he played in Gimnasia La Plata, and he wasn't, I don't think, as good as Thiago Fernandez is. I think what Thiago Fernandez has over a lot of young wingers is his ability to score and create chances. He's a really good dribbler. He has all the fundamentals to be a really good player. He's obviously still a bit raw, but considering he's only 20, his final product is actually very good. And as I said, his link to Europe and River Plate as well are linked to him. Whether he Whether he'd go to River is it's a completely different question. Whether they have the money to spend on him, especially as well, compared to, say a Lazio or whatever. But no, I'd pick him out as the player to watch in Argentina right now.
If you could choose his destination, it's a game we like to play a lot on this podcast. Where would you want his career path to potentially go? Because it's all well and good being linked to these big clubs, but if he's not going to get played and then ends up back in Argentina and is then deemed as a disappointment, which has happened hundreds of times, just purely because the agent has gone for money. But if you're his agent, where are you telling him to go? What league would you like to see him in Europe in order for him to potentially take that stepping stone?
Well, a lot of people have, claimed him to be the next Di Maria. And I think going to Portugal is the place to go for Argentinians. I don't know why, but they seem to do pretty well in the Portuguese league. Di Maria, Otamendi now, Enzo, Alan Varela, they're all done pretty well. On the flip side, you have Gianluca Prestiani, who's gone from Velez to Benfica and not exactly set it alight at all. But then again, he is still very young, so he's got a lot of time. But for me, I think the Portuguese league is a really good stepping stone into Europe for these young players because, well, they don't have as much pressure. They still get to play continental competitions. And it's a really good place to develop, as we've seen time and time again.
I'm going to throw a few players, but I'm going to touch on one in particular before we wrap up the podcast. I'm going to go back to Brazil for this, obviously. And if anyone's been listening to me vent or write across Twitter at the moment, I've been obsessed with Internacional. I think they've done an incredible job in the Brazilian league. They're on track for a top 4 finish where at the start of the season, you could have seen it, but because of the horrendous floods in the south of Brazil, them having to move out the training ground, having to change stadium, players moving on as a result, it looked as if they were going to be flirting with potentially relegation or in and around the bottom of the table. But they've just gone in this incredible run of form. And if they beat Flamengo on Wednesday, so interesting for those who are going to be listening to the podcast when it comes out on Thursday, they actually leapfrog Flamengo into 4th place and could get an automatic spot into the 2025 Libertadores group stage. And they're a team similar to Botafogo in terms of they're building a nice project there. And they've got a handful of players who probably will move on if they're tempted back into Europe. It depends if they buy into that project. We've seen it with Botafogo, aren't we? Players are keen to stay. There's been talks of Thiago Almada not going to Lyon or not coming across to Europe and enjoying his time in Brazil when he's worked his way into the Argentinian side. So, I mean, that's a huge tick for South American football. There's a few names here, but I'm well aware that we could be here all day. So we spoke about centre-back Vitao before. I think he's excellent. I think he's been one of their best players. I think he's tailor-made for a move back to Europe. Obviously, we saw him at Shakhtar. He didn't set the world alight, but I actually think his ceiling's a little bit higher. Forest and West Ham were 2 teams who were linked with him. I think a Premier League fit isn't out of the question. So he's one to... We've spoke about him in detail before, but I think he will be looking at a potential move. He's 24, so look, maybe last chance saloon for a centre-back to move to Europe. That's so painful to say, isn't it? Because he's only 24. However, I think that's how football works these days. But the one player I do want to talk about is Gabriel Carvalho, who is 17, 15 appearances. Gabriel Carvalho. Clearly, I haven't done the podcast for a few weeks and need a bit of elbow grease. Gabriel Carvalho is 17 and he's played in the last 15, 17 games for Internacional, either played in like a central role, out wide. Internacional like to play a 4-5-1 formation, and he's an excellent ball carrier. Now, there's lots of things he needs to work on, but he's only 17. Doesn't look like a 17-year-old. He's so strong in the way he likes to... Reminds me very much of Pablo Maya, but with a bit more about him in terms of that bulldog energy, that bulldog approach, as in just working the team up the pitch. Only scored 1 goal, chimed in with a couple of assists. His stats sort of are against him. He should have more. I think his XG is a little bit higher than what he's performing at. His expected assists is around 2.5 and he's on 2 at the moment. So he needs to sort of weigh in a little bit more. But he's been part of this International side that has won 13, 14, well, not won, but unbeaten in 13, 14 games in a row and dragging them into the Libertadores group stage. And Arsenal were linked a couple of months back, whether how true that is or not, but that sometimes there's no smoke without fire. And when these big players come in the market, especially from Europe, looking at these sort of 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds in Brazil, you sort of have to take notice. And he's been wonderful. I think he's been one of their best players. Underperforming, yes, when it comes to stats, but I'm not the sort of player. I wish I was. I'm not the sort of person who would still look at stats. I'd rather look at how the player's performing and like what he's bringing to the table. He's sort of running the show in the middle of the park for Internacional. So if they do stay in the Libertadores, it'll be interesting to see if he stays for another season or if he does take that plunge. Peter, Albert, have you seen much of old Gabriel there?
I've not personally, but I've watched a few videos of him since you mentioned him to me. And like you said, he's really young. He's only turned 17 in August. So
Yeah.
it's when I searched him up and to do a bit of research around him, I was shocked by the amount of games he's playing and actually how well he's doing. You know, he's, as you said, he's not really got that final product yet, but you know, he's created 23 goal scoring opportunities in 15 starts.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty good going, especially for a player so young.
It's higher than Yuri Alberto's. I know it's different, different roles, but go on.
I was just going to add that I think when he got linked to Arsenal, I think it was also the time Chelsea got linked to Gabriel from Gremio. And I know we were speaking highly of him, and rightfully so for Gabriel, that is. But Carvalho didn't garner as much attention, I feel, just because he wasn't like the popular name. Where now I feel he's kind of leapfrogged Gabriel in his development. The latter has kind of struggled at under 20s level. Meanwhile, Carvalho has actually performed very well in the game time he's gotten. It's one where, if anything, kind of reminds me of Angelo Gabriel, who also debuted at Santos at 16, and then by the time he was 18, he actually had over 100 appearances for the side. So I'm not really surprised at the trajectory, at hand. It's one where you're completely right. It's just about the stats, really, because if he manages to kind of get the numbers under his belt, then I feel a big move is beckoning. He definitely already has teams on him. Arsenal, I feel, were pretty close. I'm surprised that didn't actually materialize because it was one that, even if it materializes, he doesn't have to come immediately. So it's another 2 years of his development in Brazil because of the rules for players signing up until the age of 18. So to me, clubs like Arsenal, Brighton, any club with decent analytical departments will actually be looking into him. Yeah, it's a top tier choice actually, Nathan. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah, I think he's the next exciting player, especially in that position coming out of Brazil. I think maybe he was potentially being a little bit overlooked because International for a long period of time until the last couple of months were in and around 15th, 16th place. And there's so many times 17-year-olds are giving debuts in that league, but further down the table, people don't look at them. They're looking at teams like Flamengo, for example, Palmeiras. But I think as in the next 12 months, we'll be having the same conversation with Internacional. I think they will be breaking into that 4 to 6, and they're almost not the new Botafogo. That sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I think they will be joining in with that 4 to 6th place fight. And if they have players like this in their back pocket, I mean, he's just come out of nowhere, middle of the season, maybe given an opportunity sooner than he expected because of what was happening with players being sold, Maurizio going to Palmeiras, etc. Maybe it opened up a hole for him, and the fact that he's played those 15 games, which has dragged them into potentially 4th spot, has been very impressive. So look, another player, well, a trio of players there. We've probably heard of Yuri Alberto before, but 2 other players, maybe not, who to keep an eye on over the next couple of months ahead of the January transfer window. Look, Albert, I hope you enjoyed your debut. Peter, pleasure as always. If you have enjoyed
As
the
always.
podcast, do remember to subscribe across Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a Copa Libertadores final special. Will it be Penarol and Mineiro? We'll have to wait and see. Until next time.